All right, so recently Bobby Lee was on Bert Kreischer's podcast, and I'd say this was actually a good podcast for Bert because talking to somebody like Bobby is something he needs. You know, these two are like complete opposites, and I think it benefits Bert to be around somebody that doesn't take themselves too seriously because Bert, you know, I'm sure he already had a big ego, but then being around Tom Segura and Joe Rogan and doing arena tours, that definitely inflated it a lot. And that's what leads to him talking about how a comedian's brain is so much different than a pedestrian's. You know, I'm pretty sure he got that from Rogan. I know I've heard him say that a bunch of times. But thankfully, we have people like Stavros or Bobby Lee who will either laugh in his face when he says something like that or at least call him out on it, which needs to happen more often. Because as a society, we should have never gotten to the point where we let Bert Kreischer believe he's an artist. But here we are. Last episode with Bobby Lee, he brought up how they're artists, and Bobby's like, wait, what do you mean by that? And Bert's response is basically like, you know, we're not pedestrians. He says, we're different. We could never work a 9 to 5. It's just some shit he's heard Joe Rogan say, I'm sure. And I don't know why Bert would even care to argue this because you're always going to sound pretentious. You know, like I'm sure a lot of people think comedians are artists, but hearing a comedian, especially Bert Kreischer, try to argue that just does not go well.
She understands what makes us tick. She understands that we're artists and that we're a little complicated.
When you say artists, what do you mean?
Like we're different people. Like we wouldn't work in a 9
Yeah,
to
but
5.
what I'm saying is that because people call me an artist,
Yeah.
and in my mind, I'm like, is it art?
What you do? Yes.
Okay, so what I'm saying is podcasting an art? I don't think it is.
Oh, I think it is.
Even if you agree with him and you think podcasting is art and Bert Kreischer is an artist, I mean, hearing him call himself one is cringy. And thankfully, Bobby questioned it because hearing him explain it is even cringier. I mean, there's no need for Bert Kreischer to be referring to himself as an artist. Because also, he is not somebody that should be taking themselves that seriously. And that's why it's good for him to talk to Bobby once in a while. You know, I'm sure being around Tom and Joe, like I said, that's not making things any better. So being around Bobby, I think is good for him because Bobby doesn't seem to care as much. And he's not going to try to act like their jobs are insanely important. And it's funny seeing Bert talk to a comedian who's like the complete opposite of him. You know, Bobby has no motivation to do a comedy special or ever perform at an arena, and Bert is so confused by it. He's like, man, I could never be you because you're everybody's favorite comedian, but you've never done a special. And Bobby's like, why would I do one? And I don't know if Bert just doesn't have an answer, but he sits there for a second or two, and he's probably just thinking, well, you know, because every other comedian does it.
You're everyone's favorite comic, and you've never done a special.
So?
I know, but don't you want to do specials?
No.
Why not?
Why? Number one, I don't want to do stadiums. You know,
You
I
don't
think
enjoy it?
No. I like clubs.
Yeah, so these two have completely different mindsets. You know, everything Bert does has to be the biggest event possible, and he has to take advantage of every opportunity, and he works nonstop. But Bobby, on the other hand, he's the exact opposite. Like, he's fine just doing his own thing, going at his own pace, and he's not motivated to try to do anything crazy. And it sounds like he kind of credits his success, or at least his longevity in his career, to that.
So I don't I think the reason why I've had such a longevity, I think, is because I've just sort of like stayed at one level.
And I think there is some truth to that. And Bert could learn from this a little bit because he tries to go all out. You know, he does as much as possible. And eventually, you just can't keep up with it. He's going to get burnt out. And he always says that's his family's biggest worry, even over his drinking. He says they're just concerned about him overworking himself. And, you know, I think him doing everything he possibly can and working 24/7 doesn't really help his career in the long term, you know, because he's just focusing on too much. Like, he does a whole arena tour, and then he does that cruise. He has multiple different podcasts, and he does Two Bears, One Cave, where he has to go to Austin to film it. And he's just all over the place. You know, you could be watching some random event, like that golfing thing, and then all of a sudden he'll run out of nowhere and tackle a protester. Like, the guy's everywhere. You know, I think he probably accepts every offer he gets. And then there's a lot of pressure because there's a lot of people relying on you. Like with this arena tour, I'm sure there's a ton of employees and comics and everything. And even with his podcast, recently when Bobby's on Joe Rogan's podcast, they're both talking about how many people Bert and Tom have working for them. And they're like, yeah, that is way too much. We do not need that in our lives. You know, Joe, he could hire a ton of employees if he wanted to that I'm sure could help out. But he realizes it's just not worth it. You know, he has Jamie and then I think one other guy to help him book guests, and that's all he needs. But Bert Kreischer, on the other hand, he has 8 employees working for his podcast.
Have you been to Tom's?
Tom,
Yours?
Oh yeah.
It's like they have a real production staff.
Yeah.
There's all these people running around with clipboards, and it's like,
I went to Bert's house the other day. He had 8 people behind computers, just typing away. I don't know what the fuck they're doing. Emailing
there's
what?
social media
Yeah.
going crazy, promoting arena shows. Everyone's going nuts.
Me, no.
I don't want that in my life.
Why would you don't need it?
I don't want it.
You have a white guy.
Yeah.
You're-
Yeah, so Bert, he does not need 8 employees. Bobby says he doesn't know what they're doing. I don't think Bert does either. And now there's all this pressure on him since there's all these people relying on him, and it's just not sustainable. So Bobby's saying that it's good. He just kind of stays in the same spot his whole career. There's definitely something to that. You know, Bert, he reached the top. He's selling out arenas, but he's not going to have the kind of longevity that Bobby's had throughout his career. But I think Bert's mentality is just, you know, it's not going to last forever, so I want to take advantage of it while I can. You know, I'm going to try to do as much as possible. And he obviously likes doing massive shows and arenas and everything, so it's good he got to do that. But I think in terms of longevity, it probably wasn't the best for his career, especially because he became way more successful than he should have. You know, he shouldn't really be selling out arenas. And he just tries to do way too much. You know, having 3 podcasts and all these people running social media, it's just not really necessary. And I don't think it helps much, like Joe and Bobby are saying. And, you know, most podcasters, the ones that are doing the best right now, the comedians, Theo Vaughn, Tim Dillon, Matt and Shane, like Joe Rogan, these people, they just have 1 podcast and maybe 1 or 2 producers. And that seems like a smart move because somebody like Bert, now there's all this pressure on him with all the overhead and all these people working for him in this giant production. And then if the views go down, it hits a lot harder. So also during this podcast, when Bobby mentioned how he's never been that motivated and he's always just done his own thing and it's worked out for him, Bert is like, well, yeah, it's because you're just really talented. And Bobby's like, no, that's not it. He's like, it's just because I've never given up. You know, I've always just stayed with it. And I think he's kind of trying to be humble here, but I think it's good for Bert to be around somebody who's like, you know, it's not all just being motivated and being the most talented. And it's funny because Bert's like, well, you must have some drive because you do big things. You know, you have a really successful podcast, Bad Friends. Then you have that other one, and you can't think of the name of it. And then you can't think of Kalila's name either, which I don't blame him for forgetting her, but it's just funny that he's trying to name the big things that Bobby's doing, and he can't even name 2 things, and they don't even require that much work. I mean, I know Bad Friends is insanely successful, but it's just a podcast. I mean, it's just Bobby talking to his friend once a week for like an hour and a half. That's not that crazy, and that's still a lot for Bobby. You know, he'll show up late to it. But it's funny people act like just because you're successful at something, it means you have to be really talented and you put all this time and effort into it. But sometimes it's not always like that, especially with podcasting. You know, obviously there's some people that put a lot of work into it and have to research a lot and everything. But most of them, it's like you just show up, talking to a mic, try to be funny and entertaining, and that's about it. You know, Bobby just happens to have a good personality for a podcast. And it helps that he has self-awareness and doesn't take himself too seriously compared to some of these other comedians especially. You know, it's good he doesn't try to act like he's doing something special or doing something really important or he's an artist, you know, because comedians obviously get carried away with that shit.
It's been like this, and it's all pretty much have worked out for me.
It has. Well, it's because you're incredibly talented.
That's not why.
Bullshit.
No.
You're just amazingly talented. Like, you have to have some sort of drive in you because you do big things. You have Bad Friends, one of the biggest podcasts. The one you have with, do you still do it with, what's her name?
You've done it 3 times. You should know the name.
Give me a
It's
second.
so rude, dude.
Hold on.
It's,
Tiger Belly. Tiger Belly.
what's her name, though? I know Leanne. Okay.
I know it starts with a K.
All right.
I want to say it's
K-H.
Kai.
All right. Her name is Kalila.
I know it's Kalila.
Yeah, so Bert's starting to redeem himself here, you know, forgetting Kalila's name. That's pretty funny. But also during this podcast, Bobby, right in the beginning, he mentions how much Bert is working. He's like, man, it must be so hectic. You're doing so much stuff. And Bert starts breaking down his schedule. And Bobby's like, yeah, I do none of that. And Bert's like, well, why not? And he's like, well, why do you want to do all that? And Bert says he feels like he's just leaving stuff on the table if he doesn't. And Bobby's response to it, you could tell it hits Bert hard. And he's like, whoa, what did he just say? And he probably doesn't know if it's an insult or not. Like, also you could hear people laugh in the background. But I think Bobby's just being honest and giving him good advice.
You're stressing me out. Every time I see you, you stress me out.
Oh,
You could get 3 shows, and then also I know you have other things to do.
My day is packed. It starts at like 7 in the morning, 6 in the morning, in conference calls.
I don't do any of that.
Why?
Why? That's why don't you ask yourself that? Why do you do it?
Because I feel like I'm leaving stuff on the table.
Yeah, but you know what? Nothing that you achieve is going to fix you. It doesn't.
For real?
Yeah.
So like I said in the beginning, I think this is probably a good podcast for Bert. This is some stuff he needed to hear, and it sounded like that resonated with him, which is good because I'd say his career has probably reached its peak already, which isn't terrible. But when you're like Bert and you're always trying to get to the next thing, you're always trying to do as much as possible and put on the biggest shows possible. I think you need to start getting better at just being content with where you're at and what you have and just focusing on certain things. I think that would definitely help him. So we'll see if Bobby actually got through to him at all. But that's about it for this video. Make sure you guys go check out my Patreon account. I just posted a new video over there about the Hans Kim and Rick Diaz beef. And also I talked about another clip from this podcast where Bobby called out Bert for something. And there's a ton of other stuff, over 60 videos. You can also hear about, Kramer, Michael Richards' infamous meltdown at the Laugh Factory. So I'll put a link in the description if you want to check it out. There's a lot of stuff to go through. And then hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, and I'll catch you at the next video.